I'd like to briefly introduce Bill McKibben. He needs a little introduction by me. My name is Matthew Connolly. I'm a professor in the history department, and I direct the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative. But it might make sense just to explain the occasion. This is the last in a series of lectures we've had over the summer on climate change and global governance. This is a program where over the last 4 years, thanks to the help of Roger Hertog and the Hertog Foundation, we've looked at a series of threats that are transnational in nature and global in scope, including nuclear proliferation, pandemics, and last summer, religious violence. But as I think back about this past summer, I can't imagine doing any of this without the help of Jim Fleming, who's been critical in the work that we've done and that we continue doing. This lecture series is part of a larger program. Much of it is in the nature of research. And the research that our students are doing, I think you'll be hearing about for years to come. The idea is that there are problems in the world that we can't compartmentalize in one country, and we can't study with one discipline. What we're trying to do is to blow the walls down in a university, to liberate the people inside to work on the problems in this world, the problems that really matter. And I can't imagine anyone concluding this series who could do a better job of that than Bill McKibben. Because after all, Bill McKibben has organized a campaign that is transnational in nature and now global in scope. 350.org has had demonstrations in every country except North Korea, and I'm sure the North Koreans are not going to hold out for long. But just to point out, he's somebody he's written a dozen books. Maybe the most important of all, in historical terms even, The End of Nature. I think it's something that historians are going to be writing about for a long time to come. A book that's been translated in over 12 or 24 languages now. He's somebody who's obviously assembled vast knowledge, working on climate change for some 25 years now. But he's also, again, someone who, as we would hope of our students and others too, is trying to apply that knowledge in a way that makes a positive difference in the world. So in all these ways, I want to thank Bill McKibben for joining us, and I want to thank all of you for coming out to hear him.
Thank you for organizing this excellent program, which really is a model for the kind of ways that we should be thinking about and studying these things. Climate change, more than almost anything I can think of, demands a kind of interdisciplinarity to make even the slightest sense of it. In fact, it's a good reminder that we should think about it less as a problem, an issue, a crisis, and more as a kind of lens through which to look at the world. We spent the last 100 years looking at the world through a very economic lens, and the question that we asked before we decided most things was, will this make the economy grow larger? And if the answer was yes, then we generally decided it was a good idea. If we're wise, and maybe even if we're not, we may be forced to spend this century looking at the world through a different lens, a lens saying, does this contribute to the ongoing physical survival of the planet or not? And really that's the place where all begin. You guys have spent, those of you in this program have spent the last, 10 or 12 weeks studying, thinking about climate change sort of full on, and in that 10 or 12 weeks, we've seen record heat in parts of this planet. In the UK, where they've had the hottest stretch of weather they've ever had. In China today, and really for the last week, where they've been setting all kinds of records. In Alaska, where we've seen incredible heat. We've seen record flooding in large parts of the world, in diverse parts of the world. 5,000 people dead in India in the worst monsoon tragedy ever recorded there. Record flooding in places like Calgary and Toronto, on and on and on. Yeah, good. I don't need any pictures for a minute, so for a moment we'll just do virtual PowerPoint, and I'll just say things and the picture will come into your head, if I do it correctly. Those are just now the kind of daily manifestations of a planet that we have managed to begin to upend. and upend in this is the most significant thing by far that human beings have ever figured out how to do. In the lifetimes of everybody in this room, we have left the Holocene, the 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that covers the entire recorded history of the human species, the period of benign stability that underwrote the rise of human civilization. We are now out of the Holocene, and we're going into something else, and that's by far the biggest thing that will happen in the lifetime of anybody in this room. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, okay? Which doesn't sound like that much, and in some sense, it isn't that much. It's only the carbon we've put into the atmosphere is trapping a little bit less than 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface, so less than one of those small white Christmas tree lights per square meter of the Earth's surface. The trouble is there are a lot of square meters on the surface of the Earth, and hence that adds up to a huge amount of energy. People have tried to measure it in sort of other terms. It's the equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs a day in terms of heat energy. But those are kind of pointless measurements. Really, we can tell what it's doing, how big it is, by looking at what it's doing. By the end of last summer, 80% of the sea ice that was in the Arctic 40 years ago was gone, okay? So think about how much energy it takes to melt the millennia-old sheets of ice on the ocean in a very cold place, Think about how much energy that requires. And then think about, I was saying to people earlier this afternoon, we should think about that sort of thing more often. The destruction of the Arctic is not some remote thing. We took one of the 6 largest physical features on Earth, one of the things you can see from outer space, and we broke it. And we did it in the course of a few decades. And we're doing the same thing to everything else. Look at the ocean. It is, if you stick a strip of pH paper in the ocean now, it comes out a different color than it did 40 years ago. We managed to take the oceans, which are our metaphor for vastness, and so far we've made them about 30% more acidic over the course of 40 years. That's a pretty large change. On solid ground, the thing we notice most, I think, is changes in hydrology, in the way that water moves around the planet. The basic physical fact of this century is going to turn out to be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. So the atmosphere is about 5% wetter than it was 40 years ago. That's a staggering change in the most basic of physical parameters on Earth. And what it means is that the dice are loaded for drought and for flood. And so now we just see them routinely on an epic scale. Epic. Last summer in this country, we managed to make it hot and dry enough that we could not grow food on the most fertile farmland on Earth, okay? The year before that, we managed to make it so wet in, say, the region up above, up on the Khyber Pass, up in the, on that edge of the Himalayas, that Pakistan flooded to the point where a quarter of the country was underwater and 21 million people were driven out of their homes. That's biblical scale flooding. The precedent for that is Noah, That's the kind of world that just now routinely we see operating. And here's the scary part, okay? That's what this looks like at the very beginning of the global warming era. We've raised the temperature 1 degree so far, okay? But the same scientists who told us that was going to happen confidently tell us now that we're looking at 4 or 5 degrees before the century is out Celsius, so 8 or 9 degrees or more Fahrenheit, unless we get off coal and gas and oil very quickly, more quickly than any government, certainly our own, plans to get off it going forward. There is no reason to think that civilization in the ways that we have known it, civilization that produces great cities and great universities and things, can cope with anything like that change. The researchers, the agronomists at Stanford and University of Washington put out a study a couple of years ago that just looked at the effect on grain yields of rises in global average temperature. Forget drought, forget flood, forget all the other problems for farmers, just the fact that as it gets warmer, it gets harder to grow grain. What they found was that from this point on, each degree increase in global average temperature should cut grain yields about 10%. It was easy to see, looking at the Midwest last summer, how that's possible. It got too hot there for corn to fertilize. If the temperature is above 95 degrees for a certain length of time, corn kernels won't fertilize. Trillions of kernels of corn didn't fertilize last summer, and hence were not available to people to eat. 10% for each degree of extra warming. You all know enough about the world to be able to just do the math in your head. Imagine a world that's 2 or 3 degrees warmer with the kind of disruptions that we see from things like Sandy becoming more routine, and with 20 or 30% fewer calories on that planet. Then try to imagine any of the things you care about, development, women's issues, war and peace, anything else. What happens to those in that world? Nothing good. We can't let anything like that happen. We've got to try and arrest climate change at as low a level as we can. We're not going to stop it. It is too late for that to have happened. We've already raised the temperature 1 degree. We are basically at the point where if we do everything right, we're going to see it go up about 2 degrees. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to deal with. But what we're fighting for now is to prevent the situation where it becomes literally impossible to deal with. Okay? And that's what I mostly want to talk about today, just how that fight is going and how we're trying to build it. And let me say that, since we're in a university here, which is a kind of, happily, a sort of temple of reason, let me say that it took me a long time to figure out that reason was not going to be what would carry the day in this fight. I'm a writer by trade, and so my contribution to this would be to write a book, and I did. I wrote a book, and a lot of people read it. And when I wrote the book, I was 27. My theory of change in the world was people will read my book and then they will change. That's what it would take, and that clearly wasn't going to happen. But still, one imagined that the kind of sum total of all the books and scientific reports and things would be enough. That every year, heroes of the scientific fight, including people here at Columbia, people like Wally Brooker, or most paramount, the greatest climate scientist, maybe the greatest scientist that we have on the planet, Jim Hansen, going up to Capitol Hill year after year after year after year, that this would be enough. Saying we've faced the biggest problem we've ever faced. Here's what to do about it. The economists come in right after them for 25 years and say, relatively simple, what steps we need to take. We need to put a serious price on carbon to reflect the damage that it does in the atmosphere. One's assumption, my assumption anyway, was that this would eventually result in changes in policy, that we would take these steps in order to ward off disaster. We never took them. We have had a 25-year bipartisan effort in this country to accomplish nothing, and it's been entirely successful. And so at a certain point, relying on reason alone is a mug's game, a fool's errand. It becomes time to try and figure out why it isn't working and what to do about it. And there are a lot of answers to that question, but I think by far the biggest answer to that question has to do with power. And power in this case of the fossil fuel industry, of the relatively small number of people who make an almost unbelievable sum of money maintaining the status quo in its current form. They have been extremely effective advocates for nothing ever changing. it turns out that the easiest thing to do is to block change instead of cause it, and that if you are the wealthiest industry on earth, chances are you're going to be able to block change. Certainly that's been the story in this country and in this world. And so, at a certain point, some of us began to think about how it was we might be able to counter the power of that industry. We knew we weren't going to do it with money, because there isn't never going to be a pile of money as big as the fossil fuel industry has. I mean, literally, Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money. Okay, they have. I'm no theologian, but they have more money than God. You know, they have all the money, and if one was going to fight, they're going to win. So, what do you do in that situation? Well, historically, what you do is stop relying on reason alone and start using that reason to build movements. And movements are, in essence, a way to find other currencies to work in that aren't the currencies of the powerful. They're currencies like passion and spirit and creativity, numbers. And we have to figure out how to make those add up to more than that money. So that's what we've been trying to do. We started 350.org 5 years ago, and I see out in the audience, and I hope she will stand up, there were 7 of us who started it, and one of the very first collaborators and now the executive director of 350.org is May Boovy. And when I met May, she was a college undergraduate. In fact, all the other 7 people who started 350.org were all college undergraduates. And so it was a preposterous idea, really, to think that we would do what we decided we wanted to do, which was launch a global movement to do something about climate change. We had no money. We had 7 undergraduates, and there are 7 continents, so each one took one, okay? And we set to work. May was in charge of North America. Which actually, I mean, in some ways, she had the easiest assignment. At least she spoke the same language as most of the people in her area of responsibility, you know. So we set to work. And our work, we took the name 350.org, which is a kind of odd name. We took it for 2 reasons. One was, in early 2008, working from his office at 110th and Broadway, Jim Hansen and his team at Goddard declared that this was really the most important number on Earth. They published a paper saying 350 parts per million CO2 is the most we could safely have in the atmosphere, that above that level we can't have a planet similar to the one on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, okay, which is quite strong language for scientists to use. And of course, it's stronger language still if you know that at the moment we're well above 350 parts per million. We passed 400 this spring. We go up 2 parts per million per year. We're way too high. That's why the Arctic melted, you know, because there's too much carbon in the atmosphere. So that was one reason we took the name. The other reason was we were going to work around the world. Well, Arabic numerals translate across linguistic boundaries. Okay, we figured that was necessary. Instead of trying to come up with a slogan or a phrase or something, that the numbers would have to do the work. The work at first of movement building was just to find people like ourselves around the planet. Most of the planet you don't necessarily find, quote, environmentalists, unquote, but there is always somebody, every place you go, interested in development, in hunger, in peacemaking, in all the things that are impossible on a degrading planet. And those were our first natural allies, and we sought them out all over the world, and we said we should try to take this number and inject it into the bloodstream of the planet. And we decided to do it in the course of a single day in the fall of 2009, a year after we started. And we told everybody to do something that day and we had no idea how it would go because, as I say, there were 8 of us, and it was a pretty amateur operation, and so on and so forth. We got the first sense that it might going to work 2 or 3 days early. May and I and the rest were sitting around in a borrowed office in Lower Manhattan. We were one room around a desk with our laptops open, doing all the last-minute work, and the satellite phone rang, and it was our leader in Ethiopia. And like many of our leaders around the world, she was a she, and she was 17 years old. And in charge of Ethiopia. And she was in tears on the satellite phone, and she said, the government took away our permit for Saturday, okay? We can't hold our rally then like we were planning to. So we're going ahead and doing it today before they can stop us, okay? Which was brave, but that wasn't why she was in tears. She just kept saying, we wanted to do it the same day as everybody else. We wanted to be part of it with everybody else. We don't want to spoil it for everybody. We're so looking forward to doing everybody else. And we have 15,000 people out in the street, young people right now, chanting 350. So we were like, okay, don't worry about the date. It's all right, this is good. And it was from that moment on that things, the next, I don't know about May, but for me, the next 72 hours were some of the most moving days of my entire life. Watching these pictures flood in from around the world. Second one actually came from U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan who made a 350 with sandbags, said we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, okay? But before the weekend was over, there had been 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And what for me was most moving was to see just to see the faces of people. I'd spent much of my life hearing that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and if you had to worry where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and blah, 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 blah. And before the weekend was half over, it was clear to me that that was utter nonsense, that most of the people that we were working with around the world were poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. And oddly enough, they're just as interested in the future as anybody else. Maybe more so, because the future bears down very hard on you if you're in more vulnerable places. And I mean, look, we were in, that picture blew me away. Those are dugout canoes someplace on the Congo River above Kinshasa. So basically the place that Conrad, in his Eurocentric way, identified as the heart of darkness on the planet, okay? And it is poor. I mean, they didn't have a digital camera. They took a picture and developed it in someone's home darkroom, and it didn't come out very well, so they wrote in what the banner had said, on their thing. But that there they were, connected up, with the T-shirt even, ready to go, blew my mind. And my mind was blown over and over and over again. People's creativity was immense. And there were beautiful pictures and great ones coming in from all over the place. For the first time, the big involvement of religious communities in this kind of work. That's the head of Muslim South Africa. This guy's kind of the leader of indigenous traditions. There's Desmond Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop at the head of a big multi-faith march across Cape Town. There's our biggest evangelical college in this country, Billy Graham's alma mater. There would not have been an environmental demonstration there even a few years ago, and it's a very good sign that it's starting to happen. I'd been to Bethlehem to do some organizing, so not an easy place even to get to right at the moment. But the Dead Sea is shrinking very rapidly as temperatures rise, so people wanted to do something. Too many military checkpoints in the way so the Jordanians said, we'll make the 3 on our shore. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 on our beach. The Israelis said, we're good for the big 0, and it was a beautiful day, and it got a lot of coverage because it's rare for people it's a good sign of people putting down their kind of, really focusing on the most critical of problems. 300 big demonstrations across China. China, not always an easy place for this kind of thing. The police broke up one of them, okay, but the others went off as planned, and that's good. China is a key part of this story, and a really interesting part. They're doing lots of things wrong, pouring coal smoke into the atmosphere. They're doing lots of things right, leading the world in the installation of renewable energy in a lot of ways. Those were our brothers and sisters in the Maldives. One of my favorite places, incredibly poignant. It's a 5,000-year-old culture in this archipelago that stretches 1,200 miles across the equator in the Indian Ocean. They're unlikely to be a 5,100-year-old culture. The highest point in the archipelago is maybe 1.5 meters, 2 meters above sea level, okay? Which is a bad place to be in this century, but they are trying. Those are the student association holding their meeting in the lagoon. The president of the country, Mohammed Nasheed, taught his entire cabinet how to scuba dive. They held an underwater cabinet meeting against their dying coral reef to sign a 350 proclamation that they sent to the UN. So they're doing what they can. This was the biggest thing on Google News for about 36 hours, and I think the reason was that people didn't look the way that editors thought environmentalists were supposed to look like. That's Yemen, which might be the toughest country on earth at the moment, and that zero is all women in full black burqa. So to us, they don't look like members of the Sierra Club, you know, but their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future. They're thinking about their kids and their grandkids and the larger planet and the larger good. And that thing was going on all over the world. You know, sometimes they're thinking about themselves. This is the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi. And you can see some oil-rich sheikhs right down front in their dish-dashes. But they may be smarter than your average oil men, because there in the back is the edge, just the edge of the largest solar array on planet Earth, you know. These guys, I think, are thinking we might like to be rich no matter what, you know, and headed in that direction. There were also 400 or 500 pictures that just ended up in a file labeled 350 adorable, you know, and they were adorable, there is no question. But they were also really hard to look at. I look at the eyes of that girl in the middle every time, and I kind of almost sort of tear up. I mean, pretty good chance that they're going to be refugees in the course of their lifetime, as their country is going to be underwater. Not because of anything they did, obviously. So it's, you know, it's hard and powerful. And we've kept doing stuff like this. We've held about 20,000 rallies, and I could literally show you pictures all day, all night, well into, you know, the next 3 days, just without ever repeating, just on and on and on. And they make me very happy to see the kind of spread of human energy and place after place. And this was important educational work that we've been up to, taking this sort of climate change idea all over the world to places where, including large parts of this country, where people weren't focused on it. One of the things that interested us was that nobody had, people had said when we started 350.org, oh, that's much too complicated a name and too scientific, and it's a, no one will understand it. Everybody understood it. It's incredibly easy to understand. It's a number. We're above the number, you know, we're too high, there's too much. And people got that everywhere. And they got it with the help of art. There's Tom York of Radiohead assembled 3,000 of his closest friends and gave them all blue raincoats to make this image of King Canute trying to hold back the rising seas on Brighton Beach. We did this day of art projects so big that you had to view them really from outer space. We had a satellite company kicked in $500,000 worth of satellite time so we could get these images from all over the world. That's one of my favorites. That's in Santa Fe, and now a dry riverbed, and when the satellite came over, a few thousand people flipped these blue sheets overhead to kind of bring it back to life for a minute. Powerful, beautiful image. So, the first aim of movements is to educate, to build a movement, to get a lot of people there caring about something. And that's really important work, and it's work we keep doing. But at a certain point, movements have to go beyond that also and start really trying to match power with power, to do what they can to sort of force the issue, especially in a case like this where we have very short period of time in which to work. Unlike other social movements, you know, Dr. King always said in almost every speech, he'd quote from, I think from Lowell, he'd say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win quickly, we're not going to win. So one feels impelled all the time to up the ante, to push harder. One of the vehicles that we chose for this, May and I and others a couple of years ago, was this so-called Keystone pipeline out of the tar sands of Canada. And we chose it for a couple of reasons. One was the tar sands of Canada have a lot of carbon in them. As Jim Hansen, again, did the calculations for us, the go-to guy for thinking about climate science, he did a little paper that said, if you could burn everything, all the economically recoverable oil, all the stuff that Canada is aiming to get out of the tar sands in Alberta, that one deposit of oil up there would be enough to run the atmospheric concentration of carbon from 400 parts per million, already too high, to 540 parts per million. Just that one part of Alberta, okay? So, I mean, we literally can't burn it and do anything about climate change. There's 7 or 8 other places like that around the world that we have to keep in the ground because there's just too much carbon. But this was one of them, so that's one of the reasons we went to work. And the other reason was that the president himself was going to get to make the decision about this pipeline through a kind of strange quirk in the law. Because they wanted to run a pipeline across the border, it required a presidential permit. A law that basically in the past had been invoked mostly to determine things like bridges between New Brunswick and Maine and things. But they needed this permit for the pipeline. And so we thought, well, we'll try because it's such a big deal. Now, everybody told us that there was no hope, that it was a done deal and it was going to get approved the way that every other pipeline had been approved. In fact, in the National Journal, the kind of trade paper for Capitol Hill, they took a poll of their 300 energy insiders, lobbyists and Hill staffers and things like that. And 97% of them said, this was summer 2011, that TransCanada Company would have its permit for the pipeline by the end of 2011. So the odds were not good, but we decided to go to work. And that August, so 2 years ago now, 2 years ago in a couple of weeks, we organized what became the largest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country. And over the course of 2 weeks, 1,253 people went off to jail. And then it started to spread around the world. And they had the biggest civil disobedience action in Canada in many years, up on Parliament, up on Parliament Hill. And then, you know, our allies in much of the rest of the world started sitting in at consulates and things and embassies. And then we followed the president all around the country, wherever he went, something we're still doing. You know, he'd be greeted. He'd go to college campuses, and yes, people were happy to see him, but there were big sections of them chanting, "Yes, we can stop the pipeline," you know. And then we, a couple of months later in November, exactly a year before the 2012 election, circled the White House with people 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder, around that 1.5 mile perimeter of the White House. The first time people had tried to do that, and it was a gorgeous day. And 4 days later, the president said, okay, we're going to take a year and study this more thoroughly. Now, everybody said, a lot of people said, that's just cynical, and he's just trying to get it past the election, and the minute the election's over, he'll approve it. And we're now in that phase, obviously, and it's possible he'll approve it, but I think it's increasingly likely that maybe this movement might actually take an important win here. The president said in his first comment on this a few weeks ago, first public comment ever, he said, What we'll decide will be based on whether this adds carbon to the atmosphere or not. And if he applies that standard in good faith, then there is no way he can permit that pipeline. If he does permit it, we will know he was acting in bad faith, and we will know that he is being the kind of thing that people have caricatured him for being, you know, all talk and little action. But if he does the right thing, it'll be an important moment. It'll be the first time that a world leader has said, here's a big thing that we're not going to do because of the damage it will do to the climate. And that would be an enormous legacy, and it would be a great wedge, a kind of reopening of the international negotiations that we desperately need to have around climate change. So an important thing. Most of all, a symbol that this movement has grown large enough and noisy enough that it can begin to take on that financial strength of the fossil fuel industry. Because in that same period, they've run probably $100 million worth of TV ads over and over and over again, saying that this pipeline, you know, would, I mean, who knows what, I mean, every possible good thing short of curing leukemia, you know, they've attributed to all of it nonsense and none of it really working, you know, because the movement has gotten there. Now, of course, even were we to successfully block said pipeline, it would be a very small step indeed in the actual process of stopping climate change. We need to stop all kinds of things. There's pipelines running every which way, and coal ports that they're trying to build in the Pacific Northwest, and so on and so forth. And same in countries around the world, and we have to fight them all. But really, it's impractical to imagine beating global warming one pipeline at a time, just stopping bad things. We also have to figure out how to go on offense against this industry, how to cause them serious problems. And so in the last year, what we've tried to do with the help of many, many, many allies, some of whom are in this room, is launch this campaign of divestment to try and get people to sever their financial ties with the fossil fuel industry. And the logic of it actually came out of a piece that I wrote just about a year ago for Rolling Stone. For those of you who keep your back issues, it was the one with Justin Bieber on the cover, okay? But strangely, the editor called up the next day to say, your piece has 10 times as many likes on Facebook as Justin's. And in fact, it became one of the most widely shared pieces in the magazine's history. Not because it was so well written, but because the math in it, it was called, I think, the terrifying new math of global warming or something, was daunting enough that people really, I mean, for me it was revelatory. What it came from was this work that this team of financial analysts in the UK had done. And they'd done something we should have done a long time ago. They went and looked at all the annual reports and SEC filings and things of the fossil fuel industry and determined that the fossil fuel companies and the countries that operate like fossil fuel companies, think Venezuela, had already identified reserves equivalent to about 2,800 gigatons worth of CO2, 2,800 billion tons worth of CO2. That is, if you burned the coal and gas and oil that they've announced that they're planning to burn, that they've told investors that they're going to burn, that they're borrowed money against, it would release into the atmosphere 2,800 gigatons. The trouble is that the scientists have told us now with an almost endless array of computer models that the most we could burn and have some hope of staying below that 2-degree target, that in itself is not a very good place. 1 degree melted the Arctic. We don't really want to go to 2. But if we want to stay below it, we can burn about 500 gigatons more carbon. That is to say, they have 5 times as much carbon as even the most conservative governments on Earth think would be safe to burn. That is to say that they'd have to leave 80% of it in the ground if we're to have any chance. That is to say, if they carry out their business plan, the planet tanks. That is to say, they are to be understood as a rogue industry, a force that if, the end of this story is written. If we can't change that, then there's no longer any room for doubt or speculation or wishful thinking. We know what's going to happen. The planet's going to burn up. And they're apparently cool with that because that's what their business plan calls for, you know. And that means the rest of us can't be cool with it. And hence, we launched this divestment campaign, less to try and bankrupt them, more to turn them, to sort of politically bankrupt them, to turn them into the pariahs that they are, and weaken their ability to endlessly dominate events in places like Washington. The inspiration came from the successful movement to divest from companies doing business in apartheid South Africa a generation ago. And indeed, some of the leaders were the same people. Maybe for us, the most important and certainly the most moving kind of piece of video that we got as we launched this tour around the country last fall came from someone who'd been a 350 advisor from the beginning, Desmond Tutu in South Africa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work, among other things, helping spur the divestment movement a quarter century ago, and who said, if you could see what was going on in Africa, the drought, the famine, you would understand why I'm asking you to take up this same weapon again. Look, Desmond Tutu is one of the 3 or 4 people on this planet who have earned the right to be listened to absolutely and taken with utter seriousness. And we did, and we're doing our best to demand that everybody else do too. 380 college campuses now in this country in the course of 6 months have active divestment fights underway. 6 or 7 of them have already divested. 15 of our major cities have already divested. Seattle, San Francisco, Providence. First big religious denomination in this country, the United Church of Christ, divested a few weeks ago. There's momentum here, and there needs to be a lot more. There's great work going on in New York, all over the place. In fact, there's a meeting coming up soon from the people at Grow Divestment. If you go to, I'm looking for the URL here. Well, somebody here is from Grow Divestment. Wave your hand so everybody knows who you are, okay, and can find you. And there are people working on Columbia and Barnard divestment, and people working at NYU, and people working lots of other places. It is not all right to pay for your education, or if you're a faculty member, to pay for your salary by profiting from the wreckage of the climate. It's not okay. This is moral, deeply moral issue, and it's a deeply practical one. And so we will fight as hard as we can. We will not win everywhere right away. It'll take a couple of years, as it did in South Africa times, before the trustees of essentially conservative institutions like Columbia do the right thing. But those years will be well spent in this fight, in the educational struggle to make sure everybody understands exactly who places like Columbia are in bed with and what that means, okay? And so I'm trusting that all of you who are at places like that, who are alumna of places like that, will do what you can to make sure that leverage is exerted, and exerted soon and strongly. This fight's going to get just more interesting as time goes on. It's going to get more interesting for a couple of reasons. And really, if I were the fossil fuel industry, though groups like 350 and environmentalism in general and things look kind of puny now, I would be worried were I the Koch brothers. I think they're on the losing side of history, and I think it's only a question of how quickly we can make them lose and how much of the planet we can preserve. I think they're on the losing side of history for 2 reasons. One, every day now, the technology that's going to replace them gets better and clearer what it is. The few places around the world that have taken this challenge seriously are doing remarkable things. The Germans are probably the best example, the only non-Scandinavian country that's taken seriously this challenge, okay? And there's something ironic about that. I mean, Germany caused way more than its share of 20th century problems, okay? But they are busy providing some solutions to the biggest ones of the 21st century. There were days this summer when Germany generated more than half the power it used from solar panels within its borders, okay? That's not because, I mean, look, some of you have been to Germany. It's kind of, it's sort of foggy and Wagnerian there, Munich is north of Montreal. Think what a country could do that had, I don't know, Florida, Texas, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah to work with, But there are more solar panels in Bavaria than there are in the United States. And that's because they've had the political will to get things done. And we can build that political will, and it'll make it easier because the Germans and others are showing the way forward, showing that this technology is real and that it works. The other reason that the Koch brothers et al. Should be worried is because this movement to stand up to them has a very effective recruiting sergeant. And that recruiting sergeant is Mother Nature, who now daily demonstrates the folly of keeping on with what we're doing. A little more than a year ago at 350.org, we just sent out the call around the network to ask people to organize in places that had felt the sting of climate change. We called it Connect the Dots. And though we're used to organizing things on a big scale, we're pretty amazed with the number of places around the world where people were spontaneously kind of doing things to sort of let their pain be seen. It was actually a funny day. The day we were starting was a Friday, I guess, or on a weekend. And that morning, the big climate change denier group funded by the fossil fuel industry put up all these billboards. That's Ted Kaczynski, and their argument apparently was Ted Kaczynski had believed in global warming, therefore only crazy serial killers believe in global warming. Or something. It's not even like it's like, Hitler believed in gravity, what a poor idea or whatever, It doesn't even make sense, but for us, it was like the perfect setup, because we were able within hours of supplying millions of faces around the world that were the actual face of global warming. So the day starts first in the Pacific. So the first picture that comes in is from underwater on the dying coral reefs in the Marshall Islands. You can't have coral reefs in a hot, acid ocean. It's an ecosystem that is disappearing. Incredibly enchanting corner of God's brain that just is being carved out and in our lifetimes in front of our eyes. You would think that in Afghanistan people had other things they had to worry about, but the fact that the Kabul River is drying up is a pretty big one. And there's drought all over the place. There's pictures from Kenya, Yvonne, to sort of see what's going on in the, sea level rise in all kinds of places. Some places the damage is a little less, absolutely life-threatening, but hell, if you like to ski, it's bad that we don't really have winter in quite the same way, But everywhere, up in the boreal forest where wildfires now there are huge wildfires this summer in Alaska, more than 1 million acres so far. And this is places that never have burned because it wasn't, there's Micronesia. They're having to start evacuating islands there, move people someplace else because the water is rising too high. That's at the Dead Sea. That red balloon is where the level of the Dead Sea was 40 years ago, okay? So that gives you some idea of what's going on. That picture stuck in my mind. It was just we have a big organization in India, and there were lots of anonymous villages like this one, where I liked it because you could just faintly see that 350 was now sort of graffiti there. But the reason that struck me was it just came with a note, and all the note said was, there is no water behind our dam anymore, you know? I mean, and the same in all kinds of places. This is that zone in Pakistan I was telling you about. 20 million people, okay, forced out of their homes by flood. It's as if Hurricane Sandy had forced the evacuation of everybody between Baltimore and Boston, you know. Just incredible to even think about. And the same from all over. There's Vermont, where I live. Hurricane Irene the year before steered just clear of New York City and hammered us instead, and you can still see all the sand that's, you know, it was the biggest thing that ever happened in our state. It killed a bunch of people, and we're going to be paying for it for the next 20 years trying to replace roads and bridges. God forbid we get another one in that same period, but doubtless we will. Same all over the place, all over the place. That was maybe the picture that got me. It was probably the smallest demonstration of the day, and it was just like some street that had turned into a muddy river in Haiti. But it was just these signs that your actions affect me, which indeed they do. You know, more people died in Haiti from Hurricane Sandy than died in New York, okay? Your actions affect me, but it doesn't work the other way around. There's actually very little that anybody in Haiti can do to affect the outcome of this story beyond appeal to us. The endowment of Columbia University is greater than the GDP of Haiti, I'm almost sure. They don't have the headquarters of huge corporations to go protest at. They don't have, you know, a few hours train ride away the you know, executive mansion of the one superpower on earth where they can make themselves heard. They count on us to do that. And I want to just end by saying, you guys in the program and many of the rest of you, I mean, it's very important to talk and think about things like global warming and to research and understand them. But, you know, knowledge without action in this case really is the ruin of the soul. We have to actually do something about this. And the things that we're called to do, I think, get harder the further on we move into this thing. And I'll end with just a couple of reflections about that the civil disobedience that we organized in Washington a couple of years ago. I was thinking about it over the weekend because I was back in jail briefly in California. We did this demonstration outside the refinery, Chevron refinery in Richmond, California. We did it for two reasons. One was to mark the one-year anniversary of a section of that refinery exploding in the middle of that poor and working-class community and sending 15,000 people to the hospital. Chevron has casual disregard for its neighbors, and it has casual disregard for its planet. It gave the largest campaign contribution post-Citizens United. It gave it 2 weeks before the last election. It gave it to make sure that the House would stay in the hands of climate deniers. It was successful, which is why there'll be no legislation about carbon prices or anything in the near future. So we were there at Chevron and in handcuffs for a while, and that's why I was thinking back to this stuff we did in D.C. And there were two things about that protest that I just stick in my mind, and I want to stick in yours. The first was, and I look at the very wonderfully diverse demographics of this audience, the first was that when I wrote the letter that we sent out asking people to come, and it got signed by a bunch of my friends, by Naomi Klein and Wendell Berry and other people, but one of the things we said was, we don't think college kids should have to be the only cannon fodder here. You know, we know that they'll come to get arrested, and we know that they're leading this movement everywhere, but really right now, if you're 22 in our economy, you know, it takes a little bit of courage to get an arrest record. One of the unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? And it was good to see that many of the people who came to get arrested had hairlines like mine, you know. We did not ask people, how old are you, because that would be rude, but we did say, I think cleverly, who was president when you were born, okay? And The two biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations, okay? And the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck. He was 93, he had a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care, okay? He was so old, he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration. Now, I studied American history in college, and I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration, okay? The point is, it was very good to see elders acting like elders, okay? And we need people to do that. And frankly, if there's anybody in the room, since this is a college, who happens to have tenure, then this goes triple for you, okay? You're the most insulated, safe people in the entire world. You know, you have more, and if you don't use it for some power, then shame on you, you know? The second thing we said was, if you're going to come get arrested, would you wear a necktie or a dress when you come? And you saw the pictures of people getting hauled off. Now that's, you know, I live in Vermont. We're not really very formally minded, you know. But we wanted to make a visual point that undergirds everything I've been saying here today, which is that there is nothing radical about what we're talking about. Nothing at all. Okay? All we're asking for is a planet that works the way the planet worked that we were born onto, the way that every person whose history we know about, the last 10,000 years, a planet that worked the way that it worked for them. That's not a radical demand. That's a very conservative demand, if you think about it. Radicals work at oil companies. If you're willing to get up in the morning and make a fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, then you are engaged in an act far more radical than any human being that ever came before you. You make any sort of 60s radical blush, you know, with the scale of your ambition. It's our job to figure out how to check that radicalism and how to check it quickly enough to prevent it from just overwhelming every good thing on this planet. And frankly, there's no guarantee that we are going to win this fight. Those of you who've been studying this, and those of you who just sort of know, look around the world around you, know that really we're quite far behind, that physics is ahead at this point, okay? The Arctic melted last summer. That's a bad sign, all right? So I can't guarantee that we're going to win, but I can guarantee something thanks to people like May, or I see my other colleague Vanessa out there in the audience, and thanks to all the other people all around the country and the world who are working hard on this every day. I can't guarantee we're going to win, but I can guarantee that there's going to be a fight, that it's not going to happen unopposed, and that it's going to be a fight equal to the kind of historic scale of the problem that we face. That's a good thing to know. It'll be a pleasure for those of you who are willing to get involved to just fight it shoulder to shoulder with you going forward. Thank you all very much. Now, I rattled on for a while, and I'm sorry about that. I took more time than I should, but we have time for some questions, yes? And there's I think a microphone in the middle for questions. You want to be in charge of this phase of the operation?
Can we just ask, please, how helpful are the media being?
So how helpful is the media being? You know, look, I come from that world. This has not been a place where our journalistic enterprise has covered itself with glory. For a very long time, the media treated it as a sort of he said, she said story. I think now at Columbia Journalism School and elsewhere, we sort of use it as a prime example of what you might call false equivalence. We had 99% of scientists saying one thing, but the 1% who were saying the other got kind of equal time. And so people were left, only in this country really, but with a kind of distorted impression. That's one of the reasons that we've worked hard to kind of build our own media in a sense. And that's possible to do now in a way that wasn't possible before. when we were started those civil disobedience around the Keystone stuff, nobody would cover it. It just seemed so unlikely and so, well, I remember one reporter saying to me, "Oh, this is crazy. This just seems like some David and Goliath thing that you're doing." And I was like, "Dude, do you know the story? You know that David wins, right? In this thing, So it was infuriating in that sense. But we were able to use the web and to sort of get the message out first to our own sort of constituency and base and all the people who would sort of respond. And then it sort of kept spreading of its own right, and until a certain point the media had to write about it. And by about a year in, it was pretty clear to me that we had done what we set out to do. The day it really became clear to me was when Mitt Romney released his first television commercial of the general election. And his very first commercial, he said, looking straight into the camera, said, "In my first hour in office, my first job will be to approve the Keystone pipeline." And I was like, wow, I guess we've gotten our message through, We've put something on the map. He went on to say, which I thought was the sweetest, drollest thing I'd ever said, "If necessary, I will build it myself," he said. Which, just thinking about Mitt Romney, sort of having to, "This is the end of the shovel that goes in the ground, sir. Here's how it works. But
here, yeah, just a quick note. I mean, a lot of us in the environmental movement appreciate that what you're doing in terms of getting out the message to people who aren't necessarily so aware of climate change. But some of us are actually a bit frustrated with the sort of specifics that you put out there in terms of policy initiatives. For example, as you mentioned, it's not a technology problem. We have the technology to do a lot in this country. In terms of, Germany, for example, the feed-in tariff does a lot of work. Right. But the problem in the United States, we have a grid where we have 500 different owners. We have a power grid that's balkanized, et cetera. So the issue of whether or not you can use renewables isn't so much an issue of technology, it's an issue of what you do at the level of the locality. So, some of us in the environmental movement appreciate what you're doing, but we'd like to see a little bit less photo op, a little more on the specifics of locality.
So this is good. People, and that's one of the reasons we organize the way we do, by localities, do things close to home. And what it means is that, like, the 350 chapter in wherever is usually very engaged with just that kind of work, like 350 Vermont, where I come from, which I have nothing to do with except watch and applaud. They've sort of set themselves up, and they're working very hard to reform regulatory stuff around stuff in Vermont. And at the same time, when there are big days of action, they come together to make a kind of national and global statement too. And it's that mix of local, national, global that we're going to have in order to make this work. But you know what? I mean, none of us can do all this sort of thing. We have about, worldwide, the staff of 350.org is about 50 people. Is that right? A little bit less than 50 people. We do what we can. And we're very glad that there are zillions of other people doing what they can. And the beautiful thing about this movement as it's evolving is that it's not like sort of 60s movements. It's essentially leaderless. And what it looks like in practice as a movement is kind of what we hope the energy system will look like. Instead of a few big power plants providing all the energy, tens of millions of solar panels on tens of millions of rooftops linked together to do what needs doing. That's what
you
it's
can't do
like.
that unless you actually address the policy problem.
Exactly right.
But
exactly right.
You're doing it globally. You're not doing it piece by piece.
You have to do all these things. You have to address it globally too. I mean, look, one of the things that needs to happen, one of the policy things that needs to happen, is a price on carbon. When we get a price on carbon, it will convince an awful lot of people that there's serious money to be made in renewable energy, at which point, not carbon trading, no, I think what Hansen has called for is this fee and dividend, which is a really good policy and a sensible one. One that would put a price on carbon and collect a serious tax from the fossil fuel industry, and then just write a check to everybody in the country every month for their share, okay? In essence, the question is, who owns the sky, Exxon or us, you know? And if they're going to use it, then they should pay some rent, and we can use the rent to do things like put solar panels on our roofs and whatever else. That kind of redistribution will be one useful part. There is no one answer to climate change. There is no silver bullet. There may be enough silver buckshot if we gather it all up. And the part you're talking about is an important part, and a part that people are deeply engaged in all throughout the country that I know of, certainly every place I go.
Well, I'd like to thank you for all that you've done. I think it's perhaps the greatest understatement of my life. And I know you can't do everything, but I'm going to raise one other issue. I'm from here, but I spent 20 years in California. And I'm very aware and concerned about the development of the Monterey Shale, as well as recent legislation which looks like it's going to pave the way for that shale to be fracked. I imagine you know that, and I'll say for the audience sake, that apparently the shale is a type of, it's comparable to the tar sand in carbon intensity. So just wanted to raise those issues, see if they're on your radar.
Yeah, no, they're very much on the radar, and people in, I was just in, as I say, in California, and people were working hard to try and forestall fracking. One of the unfortunate, maybe, but useful things about the fact that fracking happened is one of the first times when one of these energy extraction technologies actually happened in a relatively crowded and prosperous place, the northeastern United States, so Pennsylvania and Ohio and things, and people really noticed and saw and got angry and stood up. And there's a lot of that sentiment that's now spreading west, happily, to California. Because the fracking for oil in California, it's a North Dakota or larger sized pool of oil there, and it becomes another one of these things that we have to keep underground. One of the reasons that we need a real price on carbon is that if we get it, it will put off limits economically hard to get at stuff. A price on carbon won't be enough to keep Saudi Arabian oil in the ground, okay? You can get that out for $3 a barrel, but if you're going to go frack, it's going to cost you $70, $80 a barrel, and any kind of serious price on carbon would make that a low priority compared to wind or sun or anything else. But yeah, we also have to stand up to it directly, and people are. And those of us in New York, those of you in New York, should continue very strongly to press Governor Cuomo to make sure that the moratorium on fracking in this state stays intact. I will boast only to say that Vermont is the one state in the union that has banned fracking altogether. So there's that. Joining Quebec and France, there's some connection between good cheese and sound environmental policy.
Bill, for those of us who are in New York who are working on fossil fuel divestment, we're talking a lot about what comes next after this, and we want to ask you often, what is your vision for when these campuses and these municipalities start caving and you see this thing like really light up?
Well, the hope is that it will translate fairly quickly, as it did in the case of South Africa, to serious pressure on the industry to change its ways. I mean, look, the ultimate goal here is... Yes,
what's the means of that?
Yeah.
That's because we know that's like a theoretical level.
Right.
And how does that?
But it comes because they're beginning to get serious pressure on their bottom line, and on their political legitimacy. So there's going to be, not this Congress, but maybe the next one, for instance. There are going to be serious proposals to do something about, say, putting a price on carbon. And we'll know how well we've done in weakening the hand of the fossil fuel industry when we see how many legislators are willing to desert them, are more scared of us than of them. And getting that analysis out is as important as the actual win on divestment. Having people understand that these guys plan to burn more carbon than any scientist thinks is safe is a really important meme to have solidly out there all the time. There's no There never is in these kind of things a kind of A follows B follows C perfect game plan for how it all works. All that we're trying to do is figure out how to build a countervailing power to that power. And this is one of the ways. And it's worth remembering whenever we think about divestment, you know, 2/3 of them, I have said earlier today, 2/3 of the most important people in this country sit on college boards of trustees, you know. Look at who's on the Columbia or the NYU or whatever board of trustees. They should be having to think at every single board meeting about who it is that they're in bed with, you know, and what it means. And they should have to feel bad about it over and over and over again. And eventually that will tell, one hopes. It'll take a little while. It took 6-7 years of really good organizing to get the South African stuff to the point where they won. But when they did, it was really significant. When Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first foreign trip he took was to the US, and he did not go first to the White House. He went first to California to thank students at the University of California system. They were one of 155 campuses that around the country that had divested. They divested, forced the divestment of $3 billion worth of stock. And Mandela said, look, we fought for our own liberation, and that was key, but we couldn't have done it without you either. It took that kind of global pressure. And so this is a fight very much worth engaging in, even though we don't know exactly how it comes out.
Bill, can I jump in on that?
Yes.
I mean, as an historian, Columbia has a history here because this was the first Ivy League university to divest itself completely of stock related to South Africa. And it came after students, I don't want to give anybody any ideas here, but students had occupied Hamilton Hall for 18 days, one of many actions that were undertaken on the campus here. But having said that, historians are still debating how much of a difference it actually made in terms of the decisions of the South African government as opposed to the work of South Africans themselves and protesting in the streets.
Historians, you know, will debate many things for many time. I'll take Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu's word for it, you know.
All right, so I'm not going to debate you on this, but what I would say is that there's actually history to learn from. Because one of the things you find, for instance, when you get inside the corporate boardrooms, the thing that really worried them wasn't so much the effect on their stock prices, and there's almost no case in which it really did depress the value of any particular stock. It was things like selective purchasing, like when state and local governments wouldn't purchase
or the ability to recruit good new talent to come work at their operations. I mean, one of the other things that started happening was people began making sure that when the recruiters from whoever it was came to campus, they were greeted by the kind of disgust they deserved to be greeted by. And this is already starting to happen in many ways. The first building takeover of this era came last spring in Providence, Rhode Island, when young people at the Rhode Island School of Design took over their administration building, and they, being good artists, it was extremely beautiful, and they hung out of the window all these banners that said, "We may be art students, but we can still do the math," they said. And I think that kind of sentiment's spreading. Look, there are many fronts in this fight. None of it by itself accomplishes what needs accomplishing. None of it by itself. Each part of it helps in a kind of epic sense.
Pipeline owners move all kinds of fluid through their pipes all the time. And there really is a big price on water, not specifically potable water, but floods and whatnot. If you ever get to the point of sitting down and negotiating with the energy people who want to put a pipeline someplace, maybe not specifically KXL, why do we always let them put one pipeline? If they were required to put like half a dozen of them and keep some empty, and then we could use them to like divert water into the Mississippi to keep commerce going, or lower some riverbeds ahead of these big storms instead of flooding people away, you know, that would be, as you alluded to at one point in your talk, some solutions that seem kind of commonsensical.
Yeah, my guess is that common sense probably at this point doesn't dictate sending the Great Lakes off to the southwest, that it really dictates keeping the temperature from rising beyond the point where you can't live in Phoenix on what's down there, you know.
One thing that you said, the 1 degree of centigrade, we've already risen.
Yeah.
I don't know a whole lot about this, but also in Canada is a frozen tundra that is encapsulating methane, which is a more potent gas. And I had last heard 2 degrees centigrade, which would imply we're halfway there. Is anybody considering how to either contain that or chemically?
No, there's no way to contain it, and it's one of the reasons why the fight is so desperate. Past a certain point, we've still got our hand to a certain degree on the CO2 thermostat. If we make changes in policy, we'll put less carbon in the atmosphere, and hence the temperature will go up less. But there's no, if we raise the temperature enough that we're causing uncontrolled release of methane into the atmosphere, there's no thermostat we have any control over. There's no policy option that refreezes the Arctic. So it's those kind of tripwires are one of the reasons why, beyond the kind of steady, incredibly dangerous, world-threatening kind of linear thing, we also should, that I described, we also should be very worried about sort of fat tail events that take us by surprise. Thank you.
In closing, the fact that the fossil fuel industry, methane being a fossil fuel, I mean, why have they gone and harvested?
Because this is very diffuse. There's no practical way to take the whole tundra and capture the methane coming out of it. It's an uncontrolled release from a vast area. Yeah.
Hi. My question is a little bit about maybe mixed messages, or like the climate change is not just one thing.
Speak into the mic.
Sorry. That climate change also interacts with other environmental stressors and other hazards we're talking about. I'm from Israel, so for me the Dead Sea images are very potent,
yes.
But I also know that they're not very related to climate change. They're actually related to water management, and very poor water management, and corrupted government, and
that's right. There are always a lot of, what academics say is things are overdetermined. There are many causes. But the hydrologists are pretty clear, for example, that virgin flows along the Jordan should already, a river that's overstretched, that's called upon to do more than it can, are pretty clear that virgin flows along the Jordan are expected to drop something like 80% in the course of this century. Because of warmer temperature. There are places, and Israel may be one of them, that have enough money to maybe desalinate enough water to keep going. But that doesn't describe most of the world, and that desalination will require vast quantities of energy, thereby increasing this cycle. So I think it pays to pay attention to climate change on top of all the other dumb things that we've done around the world to our environment. We'd be in, get me wrong, there'd be plenty for us to work on even if the climate wasn't changing, okay? But the fact that the climate is changing will make moot all the other work we're doing on everything else unless we take care of that sort of first and foremost.
Are you not concerned about using an image that's maybe not necessarily related to climate change?
I think people there were pretty clear that this was, that's what people there on the shores of the Dead Sea were saying. This is related in large part to climate change, and we know what's going to happen to this place in the future from climate change. And they seem very comfortable with doing it. And I think it was actually a really beautiful day around the Dead Sea to watch people in Israel and Palestine and Jordan able to cooperate and think about that stuff together, which I think was a really nice thing and rare enough in that region. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've read your words, but I've never heard you speak before. I consider myself a beginner in all of this, in that I've been horrified for a few years now, not realizing what's going to happen. But I'm one of those people that always looks for, but how do we get from here to there in the practicalities? And I think that there's a great place for, as you talk about, using shame, guilt, anger towards the power structure to help it change. But I also think it's extremely important for people to be inspired and feel powerful. To me, the greatest obstacle to change is this feeling that it really doesn't matter what we do or think, that the power structure is so forceful. I feel that if I, for one, feel inspired to go out and find out much more about what the Europeans have done Because it's always, well, yes, this is terrible, but how do we get from here to there? We just can't stop all the oil production. And I have a question for you.
Yes.
The question is, if we were in the U.S. were to do as much as has been done in Germany and Norway, for example, how significant would that be?
It'd be really significant. I mean, if we were putting up, if we had the same density of solar panels across, sort of per capita across the U.S. as they do across Germany, it'd be producing a lot of power, mostly because they'd be in places with a lot more sunlight, than Germany. We could be doing all kinds of things. And there are plenty of places that are. So let me give you an example, okay? Let's don't think about Germany. Let's think about a much poorer part of the world. Let's think about China. I did a piece for National Geographic on China and energy a couple of years ago. And one of the people that I talked to was a guy named Huang Ming, an engineer who runs Hemin Solar, the biggest solar hot water company in the world. Now, some of you have been to China, doubtless, in recent years, and you've noticed that there are an enormous number of buildings, solar hot water panels on the roof, okay? About 25% of Chinese, 250, 300 million people, basically the population of the US, get their domestic hot water from solar panels on the roof. That compares in this country with less than 1% of people, okay? And even most of that 1% is used for heating swimming pools. Now, when I spent the day with this guy, Huang Ming, the most interesting part of it was not the endless description of the quite simple but elegant technology of doing solar hot water. The most interesting thing was when he took me to see his private museum. And he said, here's my favorite, a lot of pictures of him shaking hands with world leaders, but the pride of place is this rusting solar hot water panel. He says, you know what that is? No, what's that? That's my favorite thing. That's one of the solar hot water panels that Jimmy Carter put on the White House in 1979 and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985, okay? And the point being, in the end, this is about structures and systems. It's about politics. It's about building the political will to do those things. And it's should be a great source of shame for us, and economically it is a great source of shame for us that a technology where we had the clear lead, we then ceded to somebody else, People who know how to do solar power are going to be better off this century than people like us who have mastered the 17th century technology of coal, It's a important thing.
Inspiration to be at least as strong as that fear.
Yes, absolutely. You need a different speaker to come do the inspiration part. I'm much better on the fear.
Okay, obviously we have
May is good on inspiration, so you have her back.
A lot of people still want to ask questions. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them, but I would ask everyone, please just ask one question so that your friends can also ask a question. Yeah.
One of the arguments by proponents of the pipeline, of course, is that without a pipeline, we have more oil traveling by rail, and more by rail means more accidents. And then the Journal had that picture a few weeks ago when there was an accident in Quebec, a terrible accident, and saying, how can one be in favor of terrible accidents like this and kill people? So, and obviously the bigger picture, but I'd be interested in hearing how you articulate the counter-argument.
Sure. Yes, the industry argument is do this or we'll kill you with our train cars. The real answer is the reason that we oppose the pipeline above all else is because by opposing the pipeline, we can stop the expansion of tar sands development in Canada. They can take a little bit out by rail, but not that much. Taking it out by rail adds $20, $25 a barrel to the cost of transporting it. That's why they want to build the pipeline. And so it becomes uneconomic to do it. That's why they spend hundreds of millions of dollars running ads to let them build a pipeline. So we will, if we're successful in beating the Keystone pipeline, the financing for expanding the tar sands will dry up. Is already starting to dry up because we've added 2 years to the timetable already, That's what the fight's about in the end. Oil, that tar sands oil in particular is dirty where it comes from. They've wrecked the lives and landscape of a beautiful part of the world that people have inhabited for a long time. It's dirty along the way when it spills or blows up or whatever. And of course, the biggest problem is it's filthy when it reaches its intended destination, the gas tank of somebody's car, and gets turned into CO2. Then it does things like melt the Arctic. I mean, we think the one study that anybody's done predicted that climate change would be killing 100 million people by 2030, almost all of them in the developed world. Those are the kind of numbers that we're talking about.
Hi, Bill. My name is Ben. I was just recently home in California with my dad, Patrick. I was talking with him, and he's a great guy. He donated to 350 for my birthday. He, is really into environmentalism. He gardens. He, composts.
I can tell there's a butt coming.
This is on recording because I want to show him. He also, one of the things he's retired, so one of the things he relies on is stocks, and he owns a great deal of stock in Chevron. And this last trip, I confronted him about it in a very calm and easy way. And he's a very open guy and loves to talk about things. And I said, I think you should divest. And he said, in a very calm and nice way, I'll think about it. And I pushed him to the edge, I think.
So here's what I'd say.
So
let's go beyond all this sort of moral. Let's just talk as an investor, okay? So the smartest, there's an easy way to tell who the best investors are, okay? Because they're the richest people. Okay? So the richest guy I actually know is this guy named Tom Steyer, Californian, Bay Area, started one of the biggest hedge funds in the country, Farallon Capital Management. He's on the Forbes 400 list of whatever it is, biggest plutocrats on earth, Last year, he stepped down as head of his hedge fund because he said, A, I don't morally want to be invested in fossil fuel anymore, and B, I think it's a terrible investment anyway going forward. I think it's a huge bubble, and that people who are invested in it are going to get caught in that bubble just like they got caught in the housing bubble 7 or 8 years ago. And so he's written a letter that we've been passing out to college boards of trustees saying, look, you guys have inside information. You're insiders in this sense. Everybody else is relying on the Wall Street Journal, which is feeding them nonsense about climate change. At your university, you have a physics department. It is filled with people who can tell you about the size of this carbon bubble and what's going to happen. So you should trade on your inside information and get the hell out of this carbon bubble before it blows up in your face. And so everything else aside, or on top of all the other good things that Patrick is doing, it just makes good sense for his portfolio to get the hell out from under these guys.
I'll let you know how it goes.
Thanks for speaking today, and thank you for the shout out to Grow. I'm Daniela. I'm a member of Barnard Columbia Divest here, and I just wanted to say that Grow is a series of nationwide meetups organized by fossil fuel divestment students. It stands for Gather, Rise, Organize, and Win, most importantly. And this Saturday, we're having a meetup in Brooklyn, and we'd love for you to come. The URL is growdivestment.org. And if you want any info about what Barnard Columbia Divest is doing, feel free to come talk to me afterwards, or Ryan, or our URL is barnardcolumbiadivest.org. Thank you.
Mr. McKibben, thank you very much for being here with us. First of all, I would like to say that I think Tom Steyer should probably publish something on Forbes or Wall Street Journal. It would be something beneficial for a lot of people in the business.
Absolutely.
Second of all, I have a quick question with regards to fracking. I was trying to find a specific article, unfortunately my cell phone died, but some arguments have been made that if we do allow for more use and more extraction of natural gas and oil, it would become more competitive with the coal industry,
right?
Which would actually probably be beneficial.
So this is the argument that people used to say, gas is a bridge to the future. As we're waiting, instead of developing solar power right away, or as we're learning how to do it, this is a less, because when you burn natural gas, it produces about half as much carbon per BTU as burning coal, okay? So there's two problems here. One is, that's true about when you burn it. When you don't burn it, when it released straight into the atmosphere, CH4, methane, is about 25 times more potent, molecule for molecule, than CO2 in trapping heat. So you have to devise a system that leaks less than 2% or so of methane. And fracking, since it's, involves breaking things apart, whatever, is a kind of system to leak a lot of stuff into the atmosphere. We don't have good numbers, but in fact there was a new study today from Utah as they flew drone aircraft with sensing equipment over fracking fields in Utah. They were finding 8 to 15% leakage rates. If that's anything like that's true, it's way worse than coal. The second problem is, even if it was only half as bad as coal, we've wasted the time in which we could have had that bridge. One of the things I have to restrain myself from doing, and I won't quite be able to here today, is since I wrote the first book about this 25 years ago, there are times when I want to say, oh, if only you'd listened to me then, okay? Because 25 years ago, we actually had a series of trajectories that were where we could have done other things and we wouldn't have solved climate change by now, but we'd be well on the way. If we were going to build a bridge, 1989 was a good time to do it, okay? Now the Arctic's melted. Now the bridge, now it doesn't look like a bridge. Now it just looks like a gangplank, and we have to, instead of sort of looking for this mythical bridge all the time, we actually have to take the leap, and do the renewables now. It's just physics. The numbers just don't work anymore in those ways. So good question.
Hi Bill, thank you so much for coming out here tonight. My name is Michael. I'm part of the divestment campaign over at Vanderbilt.
Oh, good.
Not quite local. But I have a question about communications. I'm in the geology department at Vanderbilt, and also I have a lot of friends who have family in the oil industry.
Yes.
And a lot of my peers may go into the oil industry one day. And I always have a dilemma in talking to them about climate change issues, because I know that they're good people, and I want to talk to them about this in a way that doesn't make it seem like a personal attack upon them or the ones they love.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to get around the fact that the oil industry is now a ruinous industry, and that you should try to persuade people not to go into it for their life's work, in part because with any luck, it's not going to be there for their whole life. If we're even at all rational as a planet, 20 years from now, we'll be trying desperately not to find new oil. Every new bit of oil that any geologist finds is a problem now, not a help, okay? But that is you can do that without saying you're a criminal for doing this, It's just that physics calls the tune here, We're up against a problem of physics, of numbers. And when people realize that, as scientists in general have realized, as the scientific, and even now geologists, I got the gold medal or the President's Medal or something of the American Society of Geologists last year, and it was quite an interesting thing because this is a discipline that for years the biggest employer has been the petroleum industry and things, but people are beginning to understand that that's got to change. So without I have no animus toward most people in the oil industry. I can't stand the people who run it, who know very good and well what they're doing, and continue to try and corrupt the political process so that they can keep doing what they're doing. That's wrong, and those people are bad people. But yeah, I think you can just make the case with anybody who has a scientific background that it's just, we happen to be alive at the moment when this no longer makes mathematical sense. We just can't do it.
Bill's been very good. He's been speaking for 3 hours now because we had a seminar before this, and there's the problem of numbers and questions. So let me let you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you all enormously, and good luck with the